The sun had barely risen above the bustling city of Manila, its warm rays slowly illuminating the streets, promising another day of challenges and chaos. For most, it was just another morning, but for Bobby, it was a battle between the monotony of his life and the ghosts of his past. Bobby, a man hardened by life's unrelenting trials, had long since buried any hope for a brighter future. He was a man of few words, often misunderstood by those who crossed his path. His morning routine had become almost ritualistic: a strong black coffee, a glance at the morning news, and a slow drive to his job at a car repair shop in an old, gritty part of town. It wasn't glamorous, but it was honest work. The garage was dimly lit, filled with the smell of engine oil and the constant sound of metal clanging against metal. Bobby found solace in the mechanical predictability of his work. Cars, unlike people, didn't betray or leave scars. They could be fixed, their problems identified and resolved, unlike the turmoil that haunted his heart. As he wiped grease from his hands and settled into his day, his mind wandered back to his past, a time when he had once believed in love and the possibility of happiness. But those days were long gone, buried under layers of betrayal and heartache. He had learned the hard way that trusting someone could lead to ruin. His heart, once open and full of promise, had become closed off, guarded by thick emotional walls that few could penetrate. That morning, however, was different. A bright yellow car sputtered into the garage, its engine making odd noises that caught Bobby's attention. He glanced up, only to see a woman step out of the driver's seat, looking flustered, but somehow radiating an aura of light in the otherwise gloomy shop. Rina, the woman in question, had a certain spark about her. She was dressed in a simple but stylish outfit, a white blouse tucked into a pair of jeans, her long brown hair cascading over her shoulders. There was an air of optimism around her that seemed to fill the room, a stark contrast to Bobby's perpetual gloom. Rina approached Bobby hesitantly, her eyes scanning the garage before finally meeting his gaze. "Hi, I think my car's in trouble. It's been making this weird noise, and it's driving me crazy," she said, her voice carrying a slight nervousness but also a friendly warmth. Bobby, used to being approached by customers with demands rather than kindness, merely nodded and gestured for her to pop the hood. He could sense her nervous energy, but he remained distant, his usual self. "We'll take a look," he muttered, avoiding eye contact. His tone was gruff, not out of rudeness, but because he had long since forgotten how to engage with people on a personal level. As Bobby bent over the engine, inspecting the problem, Rina stood nearby, watching him with curiosity. She couldn't help but notice the contrast between his rugged exterior and the quiet focus he seemed to have when working. He was clearly skilled, his hands moving deftly over the engine, but there was something else about him, a sadness in his eyes that made her wonder about the man behind the mechanic's facade. There was an awkward silence between them, the kind that comes when two people from completely different worlds are suddenly thrown together. Rina wasn't sure what to say, but she felt compelled to break the ice. "So, do you work here every day?" she asked, her voice light, trying to fill the gap with small talk. Bobby glanced up briefly, catching her eyes for a split second before looking away. "Yeah," he replied simply, his voice devoid of any real emotion. He wasn't interested in making conversation. For him, this was just another job, another day of dealing with people he'd likely never see again. But Rina wasn't one to give up easily. She had always believed that everyone had a story, and something about Bobby intrigued her. Maybe it was the mystery, or maybe it was the way he seemed so detached from the world around him. "I'm Rina, by the way," she added with a friendly smile, hoping to at least get him to open up a little. Bobby paused for a moment before responding, as if debating whether or not to share even the most basic information about himself. "Bobby," he said finally, his voice still flat but not unfriendly. He didn't smile, but there was a brief flicker of acknowledgement in his eyes before he returned to the task at hand. Rina, sensing that Bobby wasn't the type to engage in lighthearted chatter, decided to back off a little, but she couldn't help but feel that there was more to him than met the eye. As she watched him work, she found herself wondering about his life. What had happened to him to make him so distant? What was he hiding behind that tough exterior? After a few more minutes of silence, Bobby finally spoke again, his voice gruff but professional. "Your car's fan belt is loose. I'll tighten it up for you, but you should get it replaced soon. It'll hold for now, though." Rina nodded, grateful for his help. "Thank you," she said, her voice sincere. She hesitated for a moment before adding, "You're really good at this." Bobby didn't respond at first, but her words seemed to catch him off guard. He wasn't used to compliments, especially not from someone like Rina, who seemed so out of place in his world. "Just doing my job," he muttered, trying to downplay it. But Rina wasn't deterred. "Still, you're good at what you do. That counts for something, right?" she said with a smile, her eyes meeting his. For the first time, Bobby looked at her, really looked at her. There was something in her eyes, a kindness and genuine warmth that he hadn't encountered in a long time. It stirred something inside him, a feeling he had long since buried. But just as quickly as it appeared, he pushed it away, retreating behind his emotional walls once more. "It's done," he said abruptly, stepping away from the car and wiping his hands on a rag. "You're good to go." Rina, sensing the sudden shift in his demeanor, took a step back, unsure of what to say next. She had hoped to connect with him, to maybe learn a little more about the man behind the mechanic's mask, but it was clear that Bobby wasn't ready to let anyone in. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to him, something worth uncovering. "Thanks again," she said, her voice soft as she handed him the payment for the repair. "I appreciate it." Bobby nodded but didn't say anything more. As Rina got back into her car, she glanced at him one last time, wondering if she would ever see him again. There was something about him that tugged at her heart, a sadness that she couldn't quite put her finger on. But she knew better than to push too hard. If there was more to Bobby's story, it would have to reveal itself in time. As she drove away, Bobby watched her car disappear down the street, a strange feeling settling in his chest. He hadn't felt this way in years, a mixture of curiosity and something else he couldn't quite identify. It was unsettling, and he didn't like it. Shaking his head, Bobby turned back to his work, determined to focus on the only thing he could control, the cars in front of him. But no matter how hard he tried to push it away, the image of Rina's kind eyes and warm smile lingered in his mind. Days passed since their first encounter, but for Bobby, that brief meeting with Rina lingered in his mind like a faint echo he couldn't shake. Her smile, her lightheartedness, these were things he had long since locked away from his own life. The harshness of the world had dulled the vibrancy he once possessed. Bobby wasn't the type to dwell on things, especially not on strangers. Yet here he was, thinking of a woman whose car he had fixed in under an hour. At the repair shop, Bobby was back to his usual routine: oil changes, engine repairs, tire rotations. It was a job that kept his hands busy, but lately his mind was somewhere else. He couldn't understand why Rina had made such an impression on him. Was it her bubbly energy, the way she seemed so unaffected by the world's cruelty? Or perhaps it was her willingness to engage with him, someone who had long since given up on social niceties. Bobby tried to forget her, tried to convince himself that she was just another customer. But every time he closed his eyes at night, he could see her face, smiling, warm, and persistent. He found it both annoying and fascinating. Meanwhile, Rina had gone back to her life as well, busy with her job in fashion and the usual whirlwind of social activities. She lived a life surrounded by color and creativity, a stark contrast to the oil-stained hands and grimy garage where she had met Bobby. Yet, despite the many distractions in her world, Bobby's presence lingered in the back of her mind. There was something about him that intrigued her, something mysterious that she couldn't quite put her finger on. He was like a puzzle she wanted to solve, but she knew better than to push too hard. Fate, however, seemed to have its own plans. One Friday afternoon, a few weeks after their first encounter, Rina's car broke down again, this time on a busy street not far from the repair shop. Frustrated but not entirely surprised, she managed to pull the car over to the side of the road. As she sat in the driver's seat, staring at the dashboard, she thought of Bobby. A part of her was annoyed. Hadn't he just fixed this car? But another part of her felt a strange sense of anticipation. Maybe this was an excuse to see him again. Rina hesitated for a moment before grabbing her phone and calling the repair shop. When she heard Bobby's familiar gruff voice on the other end, she felt an unexpected flutter in her chest. "It's Rina," she said, trying to sound casual. "My car's acting up again. I think I might need your help." There was a brief pause on the line, and for a moment, Rina wondered if he even remembered her. But then Bobby's voice came through, low and steady. "Where are you? I'll come take a look." Rina gave him the location, and within 20 minutes, Bobby arrived, driving a beat-up service truck. When he stepped out of the vehicle, his expression was as unreadable as ever, but there was something in his eyes, a flicker of recognition, perhaps even a hint of amusement. Rina greeted him with a sheepish smile. "I swear, I wasn't trying to make your life difficult." Bobby grunted, his way of acknowledging her without saying much. He approached her car and opened the hood, quickly scanning the engine. As he worked, Rina couldn't help but notice the quiet confidence with which he moved. There was something oddly calming about watching him, his focus entirely on the task at hand. "You've got a leak in the radiator," Bobby said after a few minutes. "It's not a big deal, but you'll need to get it fixed soon, or it'll overheat." Rina nodded, grateful for his expertise but slightly annoyed at the car itself. "I should probably just get a new one," she joked, leaning against the car. "This one seems determined to cause me trouble." Bobby didn't respond to her joke right away, but after a moment, he looked up at her, his expression softening just a fraction. "Cars break down. Doesn't mean they're useless. Just means they need a little extra care." Rina blinked, surprised by the metaphor hidden in his words. She had expected Bobby to be distant as he was before, but there was something different in his demeanor today. A subtle shift in the way he spoke, as if he was letting his guard down, even if just a little. "You sound like you're talking about more than just cars," Rina remarked, her tone light, but with a touch of curiosity. Bobby shrugged, returning to his work. "Maybe." For the next few minutes, they stood in comfortable silence. Rina watched as Bobby worked, his hands moving with the same practiced precision she had noticed before. There was something oddly therapeutic about it, and she found herself feeling strangely at ease in his presence. When he finished, Bobby wiped his hands on a rag and looked at Rina. "You good to go? But like I said, get the radiator fixed soon. I can do it for you if you bring it by the shop." Rina smiled, sensing that this was more than just a routine offer. "I might just take you up on that," she said, her eyes meeting his. "Thanks again, Bobby. You're a lifesaver." Bobby nodded, but didn't say anything more. As Rina got into her car, she felt a strange mixture of emotions: gratitude, curiosity, and something else she couldn't quite put her finger on. There was something about Bobby that drew her in, something beyond his quiet demeanor and rough edges. She wanted to know more, but she also knew that getting to know someone like Bobby wouldn't be easy. As she drove away, Bobby watched her car disappear down the street, just as he had before. But this time, the feeling that settled in his chest was different. It wasn't just curiosity or attraction. It was something deeper, something that made him feel both excited and uneasy. He shook his head, trying to push the thoughts away. He had spent years building walls around himself, protecting his heart from the pain that came with letting people in. And yet, Rina, with her bright smile and kind eyes, was starting to chip away at those walls, whether he liked it or not. Over the next few weeks, Rina found herself thinking about Bobby more often than she cared to admit. She couldn't explain why, but there was something about him that captivated her. Maybe it was the mystery of who he was, or maybe it was the way he seemed so disconnected from the world around him, like he was carrying a weight that no one else could see. Rina wasn't one to back down from a challenge, and Bobby was certainly a challenge. She wanted to get to know him, to understand what made him tick. But she also knew that getting close to him would require patience. He wasn't the type to open up easily, and she didn't want to push him away by trying too hard. Meanwhile, Bobby found himself thinking about Rina more than he cared to admit. She was like a ray of sunshine that had somehow slipped through the cracks in his armor, brightening his world in ways he hadn't expected. He didn't want to admit it, but he liked her. He liked the way she made him feel, the way she seemed to see through his tough exterior without trying to fix him or change him. But liking someone, letting them in, that was dangerous. Bobby had been down that road before, and it had nearly destroyed him. He had learned the hard way that trusting people, especially when it came to matters of the heart, could lead to nothing but pain. And yet, despite his best efforts to keep his distance, Bobby found himself drawn to Rina. He couldn't help but wonder what it would be like to let her in, to lower his walls and see where things might go. But every time he considered it, the fear of being hurt again, of losing control, held him back. Rina, for her part, was patient. She sensed that Bobby was holding back, but she didn't push. Instead, she continued to show up at the shop whenever her car needed work, always with a smile and a kind word. And slowly, little by little, Bobby began to open up, even if just a little. He would share small pieces of himself, a story from his childhood, a comment about his work. And each time, Rina would listen, never pushing for more than he was willing to give. And as the weeks went on, their conversations grew more frequent, more personal. Bobby found himself looking forward to seeing her, to hearing her voice and feeling the warmth of her presence. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was something that scared Bobby, but also gave him hope. And for the first time in a long time, Bobby allowed himself to wonder if maybe, just maybe, he could let someone in again. The next few weeks passed like a whirlwind. Life continued at its usual pace for Bobby and Rina. But beneath the surface, something was shifting between them. What had started as a chance encounter over a malfunctioning car was now turning into something neither of them had anticipated. For Bobby, every time Rina walked into the shop, it felt like a small crack in the walls he had built around himself. Cracks that both scared and excited him. And for Rina, each visit deepened her curiosity about the man who seemed determined to keep the world at arm's length. One rainy afternoon, as the gray clouds loomed heavy over the city, Rina found herself sitting in a cafe, watching the rain pour down the windows. She had planned to meet a friend, but her friend had canceled at the last minute, leaving her alone with her thoughts. And those thoughts, much to her surprise, were focused on Bobby. Rina had always been drawn to people with depth, to those who carried a certain mystery about them. But Bobby was different. He wasn't just a puzzle she wanted to solve. There was something about him that resonated with her on a deeper level. She could sense the pain he carried, the emotional armor he wore to protect himself from the world. She had seen it before in others, but with Bobby, it felt more personal. And perhaps that was why she found herself thinking about him more than she should. The rain continued to fall, and as Rina sipped her coffee, a thought crossed her mind. She pulled out her phone and, without overthinking it, sent Bobby a text. "Hey, busy today? I'm at a cafe, and it's raining. I thought of you." She didn't expect a reply. Bobby wasn't the type to text or engage in casual conversations over the phone. But to her surprise, just a few minutes later, her phone buzzed with a response. "Where?" It was a simple question, but it made her heart skip a beat. She quickly sent him the location, not sure if he would actually show up, but hoping that maybe, just maybe, he would point. 15 minutes later, the door to the cafe opened, and there he was, Bobby, with his usual rugged look, his leather jacket slightly damp from the rain. His presence was both familiar and unexpected, and Rina couldn't help but smile when she saw him. "You actually came," she said as he approached her table. Bobby shrugged, as if trying to downplay the significance of his arrival. "Didn't have much going on?" Rina gestured to the seat across from her. "Sit. I'll get you a coffee." Bobby sat down, his eyes scanning the cozy cafe, clearly feeling out of place. It wasn't the kind of environment he frequented. Too bright, too cheerful, too full of people with lives that seemed far removed from his own. But for some reason he had come. Maybe it was because of the rain, or maybe it was because he couldn't stop thinking about Rina either. Rina returned a few moments later with 2 cups of coffee, placing one in front of Bobby before sitting back down. "So," she began, her eyes sparkling with curiosity. "What's your story, Bobby?" He raised an eyebrow, clearly uncomfortable with the question. "What do you mean?" "I mean, there's got to be more to you than just cars and fixing engines," she said, leaning forward slightly. "What's your story? Who are you?" Bobby took a sip of his coffee, his eyes dropping to the table as he thought about how to answer. He wasn't used to this kind of conversation, and he wasn't sure if he was ready to share the parts of himself he had spent years burying. But there was something about Rina, something that made him want to let her in, even if just a little. "I'm nobody special," he said finally, his voice low. "Just a guy trying to get by." Rina smiled, undeterred by his vague response. "That's not an answer. Everyone has a story. Come on, give me something." Bobby sighed, leaning back in his chair as he considered her request. He wasn't used to talking about himself, especially not with someone like Rina, who seemed to live in a world so different from his own. But there was something about her persistence, something about the way she looked at him, like she genuinely wanted to know him, not just the version of him that he showed the world. "I grew up in a small town," he said after a long pause, his voice quiet. "Didn't have much. My mom left when I was a kid, and my dad wasn't around much either. I learned early on how to take care of myself." Rina listened intently, her expression softening as Bobby spoke. She could hear the pain in his voice, the way he glossed over the details as if he didn't want to dwell on them. But the weight of his words hung heavy in the air, and she could sense that there was much more to the story. "That must have been hard," she said gently. "Growing up like that." Bobby shrugged, trying to downplay it. "It was what it was. I got by. But it must have left a mark." Rina pressed, her voice soft but insistent. "I mean, we're all shaped by the things that happen to us. You can't tell me that didn't affect you." Bobby didn't respond right away, his eyes focused on the coffee cup in front of him. He wasn't used to this, talking about his past, about the things that had hurt him. He had spent years building walls to protect himself from the pain. And here was Rina, gently but persistently chipping away at those walls. "Yeah," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "It left a mark." Rina didn't push any further. She could sense that Bobby had given her all he was willing to for now, and she respected that. But the fact that he had opened up at all was a step forward, and she felt a small flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, he was starting to trust her. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the sound of rain pattering against the windows filling the space between them. Bobby stared out at the street, watching the rain fall, his mind a jumble of thoughts and emotions he wasn't used to feeling. Rina, meanwhile, sipped her coffee and watched him, her curiosity about him only deepening. She wanted to know more, to understand what had made him the way he was. But she knew that getting to the heart of Bobby would take time, and she was willing to wait. After a while, Bobby finally spoke again, his voice breaking the silence. "What about you? What's your story?" Rina smiled, grateful for the opportunity to shift the focus away from Bobby's painful past. "My story's not as interesting as yours," she said with a laugh. "I grew up in the city, went to school, got into fashion. My parents are great, still together. I've been lucky, I guess." Bobby looked at her, his expression unreadable. "Doesn't sound like luck. Sounds like a good life." Rina shrugged. "Yeah, it's been good, but that doesn't mean I haven't had my share of struggles." Bobby raised an eyebrow. "Like what?" Rina hesitated, unsure if she wanted to delve into her own past. But if Bobby had opened up to her, even just a little, then maybe she owed him the same. "Well," she began, her voice softening, "I was engaged once. A few years ago. Thought I had it all figured out. The career, the guy, the future. But it didn't work out. He cheated, and everything fell apart." Bobby listened, his gaze steady as Rina spoke. He could hear the pain in her voice, the hurt she still carried from the betrayal. And for the first time, he realized that Rina wasn't as untouched by the world's cruelty as he had assumed. She had her own scars, her own emotional baggage. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, and he meant it. Rina smiled, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "It's okay. It was a long time ago. I'm over it now mostly, but it did teach me a lot about people, about trust." Bobby nodded, understanding all too well what she meant. Trust was a fragile thing, easily broken and difficult to repair. He had learned that lesson early in life, and it had shaped him into the man he was today, guarded, cautious, unwilling to let anyone get too close. But as he sat there with Rina, sharing pieces of himself he hadn't shared with anyone in years, he began to wonder if maybe, just maybe, trust wasn't as impossible as he had thought. The rain continued to fall outside, the world beyond the cafe windows blurred by the downpour. But inside, something was shifting between Bobby and Rina, a tentative connection, fragile yet undeniable. Neither of them knew where it would lead, but for the first time in a long time, they both felt something they hadn't felt in years. The days passed, and despite the lingering emotional walls that Bobby and Rina had both carefully constructed over the years, the connection between them continued to grow. Their encounters, whether planned or serendipitous, became more frequent, and each meeting deepened the complexity of their relationship. It was a fragile dance between two people scarred by life, but slowly finding comfort in one another. For Bobby, letting Rina into his life felt like walking a tightrope. Every moment with her was filled with both excitement and fear. He was terrified of getting close, of allowing someone to see the vulnerabilities he kept hidden. Yet every time he saw her, every time she smiled at him, the weight of his past felt a little lighter. Rina was like a beam of sunlight in his world of shadows, and he didn't know how to handle it. As for Rina, she found herself more and more drawn to Bobby's rugged exterior and the layers of pain he carried beneath it. She knew that behind his tough, silent demeanor was a man who had been through far more than he would ever admit. She was patient, knowing that trust wasn't something Bobby gave easily, but she believed that if she could break through his walls, she might find something real, something lasting. One chilly evening, Rina decided to invite Bobby to an event that she had been looking forward to for weeks, a fashion show downtown where she had a small role in styling a few of the models. It was the kind of glamorous, lively event that Bobby would likely avoid at all costs, but Rina wanted to share a part of her world with him. She sent him a casual text, not expecting much, but to her surprise, Bobby responded quickly. "I'll come," he replied, leaving Rina both delighted and curious. The night of the event arrived, and the venue was abuzz with activity. The runway was lined with shimmering lights, and the room was filled with people dressed in high fashion, mingling with glasses of champagne in hand. Rina had arrived early to prepare, ensuring that everything was perfect for the model she had styled. She moved with an air of confidence, her professional side on full display. But in the back of her mind, she couldn't help but think about Bobby and whether he would actually show up. And then, just as the show was about to start, he did. Bobby entered the venue, looking completely out of place but undeniably striking in his own way. He wasn't wearing a suit like most of the other men in attendance. Instead, he had opted for a leather jacket, dark jeans, and a simple black shirt. His rugged look contrasted sharply with the polished atmosphere of the event, but that only made him stand out more. Heads turned as he walked in, and Rina, spotting him from across the room, felt her heart skip a beat. She quickly made her way over to him, a smile spreading across her face. "You actually came," she said, her voice filled with genuine surprise and delight. Bobby shrugged, looking around at the crowd with mild discomfort. "You invited me." Rina laughed softly, taking his arm and leading him toward a quieter corner of the room. "I didn't think this was really your scene," she admitted. "It's not," Bobby said, glancing at the people around them, all dressed to the nines and chatting animatedly about things he didn't care to understand. "But you are." Rina's heart fluttered at his words, and she looked up at him, her smile softening. "Thank you for coming. It means a lot." Bobby met her gaze, and for a moment, the noise of the crowd seemed to fade into the background. He wasn't sure why he had come. Maybe it was because he couldn't stop thinking about her, or maybe it was because he wanted to see if he could be a part of her world, even for just one night. Whatever the reason, he was there, and the look in Rina's eyes made it feel like the right decision. The show began soon after, and Rina returned to her duties, leaving Bobby to watch from the sidelines. He stood at the edge of the room, his arms crossed as he observed the models strut down the runway in their extravagant outfits. It was all so foreign to him. The glamour, the attention, the opulence. He felt like an outsider, but then again, that was nothing new as the night went on. Several people approached Rina, congratulating her on her work and praising her eye for fashion. She was in her element, gracefully accepting the compliments while keeping an eye on Bobby, who remained in the background, watching her with an intensity that made her heart race. After the show, Rina found Bobby standing by the bar, nursing a drink. She walked over to him, her heels clicking softly against the marble floor. "So, what did you think?" she asked, leaning against the bar beside him. Bobby glanced at her, then back at the room. "It's not my thing," he admitted, his voice low. "But you were great." Rina smiled, her cheeks warming at his compliment. "Thanks. I'm glad you came, even if it wasn't your thing." Bobby took a sip of his drink, his eyes focused on her. "Why'd you invite me?" Rina paused, considering the question. Why had she invited him? Part of her had wanted to see how he would react to being in her world, to see if he could fit into her life the way she was beginning to fit into his. But there was more to it than that. She wanted him there because, despite the differences in their lives, she felt a connection to him that she couldn't explain. "I wanted you to see what I do," she said honestly. "And I wanted to spend time with you." Bobby's expression softened slightly, and for the first time, Rina saw a hint of vulnerability in his eyes. He was still guarded, still holding back, but she could sense that he was beginning to let her in, little by little. "Let's get out of here," Bobby said suddenly, his voice firm but not unkind. "This place isn't for me." Rina hesitated for a moment, glancing around at the glamorous crowd. She had worked hard to be a part of this world, to build a career that she was proud of. But as she looked at Bobby, standing there in his leather jacket, so out of place, yet so undeniably himself, she realized that there was more to life than the world she had built. There was something real, something raw in Bobby that she couldn't ignore. "Okay," she agreed, grabbing her coat and slipping it on. "Let's go." They left the venue together, stepping out into the cool night air. The city was alive with the sounds of traffic and distant music, but for a moment, it felt like they were the only two people in the world. Bobby led her to his motorcycle, a sleek black machine that matched his rough and tumble persona perfectly. "You want to ride?" he asked, handing her a helmet. Rina looked at the motorcycle, then back at Bobby. She had never ridden on a motorcycle before, and the thought of it both excited and terrified her. But there was something about the idea of being with Bobby, of experiencing the world the way he did, that made her throw caution to the wind. "Sure," she said, taking the helmet and strapping it on. Bobby mounted the bike, and Rina climbed on behind him, wrapping her arms around his waist. The engine roared to life beneath them, and as they sped off into the night, Rina felt a rush of adrenaline unlike anything she had ever experienced. The wind whipped through her hair, and the city lights blurred as they zoomed through the streets. For Bobby, the feeling of Rina holding on to him, trusting him in a way that few people ever had, stirred something deep inside. He wasn't used to letting people get close, to letting them see the real him. But with Rina, it felt different. It felt like maybe, just maybe, he could let her in. They rode for what felt like hours, weaving through the city streets until they finally reached the outskirts of town. Bobby pulled the bike to a stop near a quiet park, the moonlight casting a soft glow over the trees. Rina climbed off the bike, her heart still racing from the ride. "That was amazing," she said, her voice breathless with excitement. Bobby chuckled softly, pulling off his helmet and running a hand through his hair. "Glad you liked it." Rina smiled, her eyes sparkling with the thrill of the adventure. She had never done anything like that before, and she felt alive in a way she hadn't in years. She looked at Bobby, and for the first time, she saw him not just as the tough, brooding mechanic, but as someone who had layers upon layers of depth. "Why don't we do this more often?" she asked, her voice softening as she moved closer to him. Bobby's eyes darkened slightly, and he glanced away, the walls around him starting to rise again. "Because it doesn't last," he said quietly. "Things like this, they don't last." Rina reached out, gently touching his arm. "Maybe they don't, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't try." Bobby looked at her, his expression torn between wanting to believe her and the fear that came from years of disappointment and betrayal. He wanted to let her in, to believe that maybe he could have something real with her. But the scars of his past were deep, and they weren't so easily forgotten. For a moment, they stood there in the moonlight, the silence between them heavy with unspoken emotions. And then, slowly, Bobby reached out and took Rina's hand, his grip firm but gentle. "Maybe," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. And in that moment, something shifted between them. The walls that had kept them apart began to crumble. And for the first time, they both allowed themselves to believe that maybe, just maybe, they could have something more. Their worlds had collided, and while the road ahead was uncertain, one thing was clear: neither of them would ever be the same again. The motorcycle's roar echoed through the quiet streets as Bobby and Rina rode back into the heart of the city. The once vibrant energy of the night had given way to a serene calm. And for the first time in years, Bobby found himself feeling something he thought he had lost long ago: peace. With Rena's arms wrapped tightly around him, her body pressed against his back, it felt like the weight of his troubled past momentarily lifted. It was an unfamiliar sensation, one he didn't quite know how to handle. Bobby had always been a lone wolf, finding solace in solitude and distance. The walls he had built around himself were impenetrable, or so he believed. But now, with every moment he spent with Rina, those walls were starting to crack. They rode in silence, but it wasn't an uncomfortable silence. Instead, it was a quiet acknowledgement of the connection that was growing between them, a bond that neither of them had fully expected but couldn't deny. The streets passed by in a blur of neon lights and shadowed alleys, and soon, they found themselves back at Rina's apartment building. Bobby pulled the motorcycle to a stop and killed the engine, the sudden quiet almost startling. Rina hesitated for a moment before climbing off the bike, taking off her helmet and shaking out her hair, which had become slightly tousled from the ride. She looked at Bobby, her eyes reflecting the soft glow of the streetlights, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. "Thanks for the ride," Rina finally said, her voice soft and warm. Bobby nodded, his gaze locked on hers. He wasn't sure what to say, wasn't sure how to process the swirl of emotions inside him. He had never been good at talking about his feelings, and the vulnerability he was feeling now was unsettling. But something about Rina made him want to try, made him want to open up in a way he never had before. "I'll walk you to your door," Bobby said gruffly, more out of habit than anything else. Rina smiled softly and nodded, leading the way toward the entrance of her apartment building. They walked side by side in silence, the cool night air wrapping around them like a comforting embrace. When they reached her door, Rina turned to face Bobby, her expression thoughtful. "You know," she said quietly, "I've had a lot of fun tonight. More fun than I've had in a long time." Bobby shifted uncomfortably, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. He wasn't used to compliments or praise. In his world, life was about survival, about getting through each day without getting too close to anyone. But with Rina, it was different. She had a way of making him feel seen, and that scared him more than anything. "I'm glad," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. Rina took a step closer to him, her eyes searching his face. She could see the struggle in his expression, the internal battle he was fighting between wanting to let her in and keeping his distance. She understood it because she had her own walls, her own fears. But something about Bobby made her want to take a chance, to push past the fear and see where this could go. "Bobby," she began, her voice soft but firm, "I know you're not used to this, to letting people in, but I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere." Bobby tensed at her words, his instinctive reaction to pull back kicking in. He had heard similar words before, promises from people who had eventually left him behind, abandoned him when things got tough. But as he looked into Rina's eyes, he saw something different. She wasn't just saying those words to placate him. She meant them. "I don't know how to do this," Bobby admitted, his voice low and rough. "I don't know how to be with someone." Rina smiled gently, her hand reaching out to touch his arm. "You don't have to know everything right now. We'll figure it out together." Her touch was soft, reassuring, and for the first time in years, Bobby felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, he didn't have to go through life alone. Maybe there was a chance for something more. But the fear still lingered, the fear of getting hurt again, of losing someone he cared about. He had been down that road before, and it had nearly destroyed him. "I'm not good at this," he repeated, his voice thick with uncertainty. Rina stepped even closer, her hand gently sliding down his arm until her fingers found his. She squeezed his hand softly, a silent promise that she was there, that she wasn't going to let him push her away. "You don't have to be good at it," she whispered. "Just be yourself." Bobby's heart pounded in his chest as he looked down at their intertwined hands. He had always prided himself on being strong, on being able to handle anything that life threw his way. But standing there with Rina, he realized that maybe true strength wasn't about keeping people at arm's length. Maybe it was about letting someone in, about being vulnerable and trusting that they wouldn't hurt you. For a long moment, they stood there in silence, the weight of the moment pressing down on them. And then, slowly, Bobby leaned in. His lips met hers in a soft, hesitant kiss, a kiss that was both tender and filled with the unspoken emotions that had been building between them for weeks. Rina's hand slid up to cup the back of his neck, pulling him closer as she deepened the kiss, her heart racing in her chest. When they finally pulled apart, they were both breathless, their foreheads resting against each other as they tried to steady their racing hearts. "I should go," Bobby murmured, though he made no move to leave. Rina smiled, her fingers gently brushing the back of his neck. "You don't have to." Bobby hesitated, his internal battle raging once again. Part of him wanted to stay, to let himself fall into the comfort and warmth that Rina offered. But the other part, the part that had been hardened by years of pain and betrayal, told him to run, to protect himself before he got hurt again. "I'm not ready for this," he admitted, his voice filled with regret. Rina nodded, understanding in her eyes. "I know, but when you are, I'll be here." Bobby swallowed hard, his throat tight with emotion. He wasn't used to this, to someone being patient with him, to someone caring enough to wait. It was terrifying and comforting all at once. "I'll see you soon," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Rina nodded, her smile soft and reassuring. "Good night, Bobby." With one last look, Bobby turned and walked away, the weight of his past still heavy on his shoulders. But as he climbed on his motorcycle and rode off into the night, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted inside him. That maybe, just maybe, there was hope for a future he had long since given up on. The next few days were a blur of work and routine for both Bobby and Rina. They went about their lives, but the memory of that night lingered between them, unspoken but ever present. Bobby found himself thinking about Rina more than he cared to admit, replaying their kiss in his mind and wondering if he had made a mistake by pulling back. He had always believed that love was a weakness, that it made you vulnerable to getting hurt. But with Rina, it felt different. It felt like maybe love wasn't about weakness at all. Maybe it was about finding strength in someone else, about letting them see the parts of you that you kept hidden from the rest of the world. Rina, for her part, was patient. She didn't push Bobby or demand anything from him. She went about her work, knowing that when Bobby was ready, he would come to her. It wasn't easy. She cared for him deeply, and every moment they spent apart made her heart ache. But she knew that Bobby's past was filled with pain, and she was willing to wait for him to come to terms with his feelings. One evening, about a week after their kiss, Bobby found himself standing outside Rina's apartment building once again. He hadn't planned to come here. In fact, he had spent the entire day convincing himself that he should stay away. But something had pulled him here, a force stronger than his fear or his doubts. He stood there for a long moment, staring up at her window, his heart pounding in his chest. And then, before he could talk himself out of it, he walked inside. Rina opened the door to find Bobby standing there, his expression conflicted but determined. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the weight of the past week hanging heavily between them. "I can't stop thinking about you," Bobby admitted, his voice low and filled with emotion. "And it scares the hell out of me." Rina stepped aside, allowing him to come inside. She closed the door behind him and turned to face him, her heart pounding in her chest. "I'm scared too," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I'm willing to take the risk." Bobby took a deep breath, his hands trembling slightly as he reached for her. "I don't know how to do this, but I want to try. With you." Rina's eyes filled with tears, but she smiled, her heart swelling with emotion. "That's all I've ever wanted." And with that, the distance between them disappeared. Bobby pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly as if he was afraid to let go. The days passed quickly after that night, when Bobby showed up at Rina's apartment, his heart on the line, admitting that he was terrified but ready to try. Their relationship, once simmering with tension and unspoken emotions, had finally burst into life. Yet, for all the warmth and connection they now shared, there was still a sense of fragility in the air, like a delicate flower blossoming in unpredictable weather. Bobby found himself spending more time at Rina's apartment, something he never imagined he'd be comfortable doing. The once cold-hearted, hardened man who had built his life on survival and distance was now sitting on a plush couch, sharing meals and stolen glances with a woman who had completely changed his perspective. Every morning he woke up, wondering how this had happened, how someone like Rina had broken through his defenses. Yet, even with his growing affection for her, an uncomfortable fear always lingered beneath the surface. A fear that this happiness was too good to be true, that it could all slip away as easily as it had come. Rina, on the other hand, was thriving. She hadn't realized how lonely she had been until Bobby became a part of her life. It wasn't just his presence that filled the empty spaces in her days. It was his sincerity, the quiet ways he showed he cared, even though he struggled to voice his emotions. When he would fix something around the apartment without being asked or surprise her with coffee from her favorite cafe, she saw beyond the man who had kept himself locked away for so long. She saw the potential for something lasting, something real. But just as Bobby's fear gnawed at him, Rina had her own doubts. They sat together on a Wednesday evening, a typical night, watching a movie neither of them was paying much attention to. Bobby was on the couch, leaning against the armrest, while Rina was nestled beside him, her legs tucked under her. She absent-mindedly played with the hem of her shirt, feeling the weight of the question she had been meaning to ask for days. Bobby's arm was draped over the back of the couch, his hand brushing against her shoulder every now and then, a subtle reminder of the connection they shared. Yet, she could feel the tension in his body, the way he occasionally stiffened or glanced at the door as if he were ready to bolt. It was becoming harder to ignore the signs, the way he still held back, even when he was physically close, the way he always seemed one step away from retreating into himself. Rina sighed softly, turning off the TV and sitting up straighter, forcing Bobby to take notice. His gaze shifted to her, his brow furrowing slightly as he sensed the change in her demeanor. "What's on your mind?" he asked, his voice low and cautious. Rina bit her lip, unsure of how to broach the subject without sounding like she was accusing him of something. But she couldn't continue like this, always feeling as though they were walking on eggshells, both afraid of what could go wrong. "I've been thinking," she began, her voice careful, "about us." Bobby's expression immediately shifted into one of wariness. He hated conversations that started with those words. "What about us?" Rina sighed again, her fingers twisting the fabric of her shirt nervously. "I know this hasn't been easy for you. Opening up, letting someone in. I understand that, and I don't want to push you, but I also need to know where we stand." Bobby's jaw tightened. He knew this was coming. He had felt it in the way Rina looked at him lately, as if she was waiting for him to take the next step. But the truth was he didn't know if he could. The fear of losing her, of messing things up, was always in the back of his mind. "Where we stand," he repeated, his tone guarded. Rina nodded, looking him directly in the eyes. "Yes, I care about you, Bobby. A lot. But I can't keep wondering if you're 1 foot out the door. Every time you leave, I don't know if you're coming back." Her words hit him like a punch to the gut. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. Instead, he looked away, staring at the floor as the weight of her words settled over him. "I'm not asking for a guarantee," Rina continued, her voice soft but firm. "I know life doesn't work like that, but I need to know if you're willing to really try. If you want this as much as I do." Bobby remained silent for a long moment, his thoughts swirling in his mind. He knew Rina was right. He had been holding back, keeping her at arm's length even when he didn't want to. It wasn't because he didn't care about her. It was because he cared too much. He had lost too many people in his life, and the idea of losing Rina scared him more than anything. But he couldn't ignore the fact that by keeping her at a distance, he was already pushing her away. "I want this," he finally said, his voice low and raw with emotion. "But I don't know how to do this, Rina. I've never been good at relationships. I don't want to hurt you." Rina reached out and took his hand, her touch gentle but insistent. "You're not going to hurt me by trying. What hurts is feeling like you're not all in. I need to know that you're willing to take that leap with me, even if it's scary." Bobby swallowed hard, his throat tight with emotion. He had spent so long building walls around his heart, convincing himself that he didn't need anyone. But Rina had changed all of that. She had shown him that there was more to life than just surviving, that there was something worth fighting for. "I'm scared," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm scared of losing you." Rina's heart ached at the vulnerability in his voice. She had always known that Bobby carried a heavy burden, that his past had scarred him deeply. But hearing him admit his fears so openly was a step she hadn't expected, and it made her love him even more. "You're not going to lose me," she said softly. "Not unless you push me away." Bobby's grip on her hand tightened, as if he was holding on to her for dear life. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and hope. And for the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to believe that maybe he didn't have to face the world alone. "I don't want to push you away," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't want to lose you, Rina. I don't know how to do this." Rina smiled, her heart swelling with affection for the man sitting before her. "We'll figure it out together," she said gently. "One step at a time." Bobby nodded, the weight of his fears still heavy on his shoulders, but tempered by the warmth of Rina's reassurance. He knew it wasn't going to be easy. Nothing worth having ever was. But for the first time in his life, he was willing to try. He was willing to take that leap, even if it terrified him. They sat in silence for a while, the tension between them slowly dissipating as they held on to each other, both knowing that the road ahead would be filled with challenges, but also with the promise of something real, something worth fighting for. The days that followed were a turning point in their relationship. Bobby began to open up more, sharing pieces of his past that he had kept buried for years. It wasn't easy. Each memory he revealed felt like tearing open an old wound, but Rina was there, always patient, always understanding. She never pushed him to say more than he was ready to, but her quiet support gave him the strength to face his demons. One evening, as they sat together in Rina's apartment, Bobby finally told her about his father. It was a story he had never shared with anyone, a chapter of his life that had shaped him in ways he was still trying to understand. "My dad was a good man," Bobby began, his voice rough with emotion. "He worked hard, did everything he could to provide for us. But life wasn't easy. We didn't have much, and he struggled to make ends meet. I remember watching him work 2, sometimes 3 jobs, just to keep food on the table." Rina listened quietly, her hand resting on Bobby's arm as he spoke. She could hear the pain in his voice, the weight of the memories pressing down on him. "When I was 13, he got sick. Real sick. Cancer. We didn't have the money for proper treatment, so he just wasted away. I watched him get weaker every day, and there was nothing I could do about it." Bobby's voice cracked, and he paused for a moment, struggling to keep his composure. Rina's heart broke for him, for the boy he had been, forced to watch his father suffer. She squeezed his arm gently, silently encouraging him to continue. "He died a few months later," Bobby said, his voice barely above a whisper. "And everything changed after that. My mom, she couldn't handle it. She fell apart, started drinking. She was never the same after he died." He ran a hand through his hair, the memories clearly weighing heavily on him. "I had to grow up fast. I started working, trying to keep us afloat. But it was never enough. I had to take care of her when she should have been taking care of me. It screwed me up, Rina. It made me think that I couldn't rely on anyone, that I had to do everything on my own." Rina's eyes filled with tears as she listened to Bobby's story. She had known that his past was difficult, but hearing the full extent of his pain made her understand him on a deeper level. It explained so much about why he was the way he was, why he struggled to let people in. "You don't have to do everything on your own anymore," Rina said softly, her voice filled with emotion. "I'm here for you, Bobby. We're in this together." Bobby looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and disbelief. He had spent so long believing that he was alone, that he couldn't trust anyone to stay by his side. But Rina was different. She wasn't just saying the words, she meant them. "I don't deserve you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Rina shook her head, a tear slipping down her cheek. "Yes, you do. You deserve happiness, Bobby. You deserve to be loved." Bobby reached out and wiped the tear from her cheek, his touch gentle and reverent. In that moment, he realized that he didn't have to face his demons alone. Rina was with him, and for the first time in his life, he allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, he could let go of the past and build something new, something real, with her. As the weeks turned into months, Bobby and Rina's relationship deepened. They spent lazy weekends together, exploring the city, cooking meals side by side, and sharing secrets under the stars. Bobby began to find joy in the little things. like the sound of Rina's laughter as they tried to bake a cake together, which ended in flour fights and deliciously burnt edges. Every shared moment filled the emptiness he had carried for so long, gradually erasing the shadows of his past. But with each passing day, Bobby still faced the remnants of his fears. He often found himself slipping into old habits, isolating himself when the weight of emotions became too much to bear. Rina noticed the subtle changes in him. The way he would sometimes stare into the distance as if grappling with his inner turmoil. One evening, while they were curled up on the couch watching a movie, Rina sensed something was off. She glanced sideways at him, noticing the way he had clenched his jaw and how his fingers drummed anxiously against his knee. "Bobby," she asked gently, breaking the comfortable silence that had settled between them. "What's wrong?" He hesitated, unsure of how to voice the swirling thoughts in his mind. "It's nothing. Just thinking." Rina turned to face him fully, her heart pounding at the thought of his discomfort. "You know you can talk to me, right? I want to help you through whatever's bothering you." Bobby sighed, his shoulders sagging as he leaned back against the couch. "It's just sometimes I feel like I'm in." Bobby sighed, his shoulders sagging as he leaned back against the couch. "It's just sometimes I feel like I'm not good enough for you. Like I'm still that broken guy who doesn't deserve happiness. I don't want to bring you down with my baggage." Rina's heart ached at his words. She had seen Bobby struggle, how he battled with his past, but she also saw the strength he showed every day just by being with her. "Bobby, we all have baggage. It's part of being human. You're not broken. You're healing. And I'm here to help you heal, not to judge you." He turned to her, his eyes searching hers, as if trying to decipher her sincerity. "But what if I mess it up? What if I push you away again?" "You won't," Rina assured him, her voice steady and comforting. "And if you ever feel that way, you just need to tell me. I'm not going anywhere. I want to be with you. All of you, the good, the bad, and everything in between." Her words wrapped around him like a warm blanket, easing some of the tension that had built up in his chest. He took a deep breath, finally allowing himself to let go of some of the burdens he had carried alone for so long. "I'm scared," he admitted, his voice low, "but I'm also willing to try." Rina smiled, her heart swelling with love and admiration for the man before her. "That's all I ask. We'll figure it out together, one step at a time." With her encouragement, Bobby began to open up more, sharing the small insecurities that nagged at him, while Rina reassured him every step of the way. They started going to therapy together, which helped Bobby navigate his feelings and learn healthier ways to cope with his past. That as the therapy sessions progressed, Bobby discovered more about himself than he ever anticipated. He learned to embrace vulnerability as a strength, recognizing that it allowed him to connect with Rina on a deeper level. With Rina by his side, he felt empowered to confront the pain he had buried for too long. The more he shared with her, the more he understood that he was not alone in this journey. One chilly evening, they found themselves on a walk through the park, the trees shedding their leaves as autumn embraced the world around them. The air was crisp, and the golden hues of the setting sun painted a beautiful backdrop. Rina wrapped her arm around Bobby's waist, leaning into him for warmth as they strolled along the path. "Look at how beautiful everything is," she said, her eyes sparkling as she admired the vibrant colors of the trees. "It reminds me of how our lives are changing like a new season." Bobby smiled down at her, feeling a warmth spreading through him. "Yeah, it's like we're shedding our old selves and embracing something new." Rina stopped and turned to him, her expression serious. "Exactly. We've both been through so much, but we're still here, and we're moving forward. I believe in us." Her words struck a chord in Bobby's heart. He had never had anyone who believed in him quite like Rina did, and it made him feel invincible. "I believe in us too," he replied, sincerity evident in his voice. "You've changed my life, Rina." As they stood together, the golden sunlight filtering through the branches above, Bobby leaned down, capturing Rina's lips in a gentle kiss. It was a kiss filled with hope, love, and the promise of a beautiful future. It felt as though the world around them had faded away, leaving only the two of them in that moment. Two souls intertwined, ready to face whatever life had in store. Months passed, and with each day, their bond grew stronger. Bobby found himself falling deeper in love with Rina, captivated by her kindness, her laughter, and the way she saw the world. She had a knack for finding beauty in the mundane and shared that perspective with him, helping him appreciate the little moments that often slipped by unnoticed. One evening, as they sat on Rina's balcony, sipping hot chocolate and watching the stars twinkle in the clear night sky, Bobby felt a rush of emotion. He realized he couldn't imagine a life without her. She was not just his partner. She was his best friend, his confidant, his everything. "Rina," he began, his heart racing as he contemplated the weight of what he was about to say. "Yeah." She looked up at him, her eyes sparkling with curiosity. Bobby took a deep breath, summoning all his courage. "I've been thinking about us, about our future." Rina's heart skipped a beat, excitement coursing through her veins. "What about our future? I want to spend the rest of my life with you," he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I want to build a life together, create our own adventures, face challenges hand in hand." Rina's breath caught in her throat, tears welling in her eyes as she smiled at him, her heart swelling with love. "You want that too?" "More than anything," he admitted, reaching for her hand. "I've never felt this way about anyone before. You've brought light into my life, and I want to be with you for always." With his heart pounding, Bobby reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. He opened it to reveal a beautiful ring, its sparkling diamond catching the moonlight. "Rina, will you marry me?" Tears streamed down her cheeks as she gazed at the ring, her heart bursting with joy. "Yes, 1,000 times yes," she exclaimed, throwing her arms around him. Bobby slipped the ring onto her finger, his heart soaring as he held her close. It felt as though the world had melted away, leaving only the two of them in their perfect moment. "I can't believe this is happening." Rina laughed through her tears, her heart filled with happiness. "You make me so incredibly happy." Bobby grinned, reveling in the warmth of her embrace. "I never thought I could feel this way about anyone. You've shown me that love is worth fighting for." From that moment, they began planning their wedding together, sharing dreams of their future as they picked out venues, flowers, and everything in between. It was a whirlwind of laughter and joy, and with each passing day, Bobby felt more certain of his decision. Their friends and family were overjoyed at the news, showering them with love and support. Rina's parents welcomed Bobby with open arms, recognizing how happy he made their daughter. Bobby, for his part, was grateful to have their acceptance, knowing how important it was to Rina. As the wedding day approached, the excitement built, but so did the pressure. Bobby began to feel the weight of expectations, the desire to make the day perfect for Rina, to prove that he was worthy of her love. But with Rina by his side, he found solace that on the morning of their wedding, Bobby stood nervously at the altar, his heart racing as he waited for Rina to walk down the aisle. The sun streamed through the trees, illuminating the garden where they had chosen to tie the knot. As he watched guests take their seats, he couldn't help but feel overwhelmed with gratitude. And then he saw her, Rina, radiant in her white gown, walking towards him. His breath caught in his throat as she drew closer, her eyes sparkling with love and joy. The moment their gazes locked, everything else faded away. It was just the two of them, lost in a world of their own. Rina reached the altar, and Bobby took her hands in his, feeling a wave of calm wash over him. Their vows were heartfelt and genuine, spoken from a place of deep connection. Bobby promised to love Rina fiercely, to support her through every challenge, and to cherish every moment they shared. Rina promised to stand by Bobby's side, to lift him up, and to love him unconditionally, just as he loved her. When it came time for the officiant to pronounce them husband and wife, Bobby's heart soared as he heard those magical words. He leaned down, capturing Rina's lips in a passionate kiss that sealed their vows. The world erupted into cheers, but all they could hear was each other's laughter, echoing the love they felt. With their wedding day behind them, Bobby and Rina embarked on their journey as a married couple, their hearts brimming with love and excitement. They spent their honeymoon traveling to beautiful destinations, exploring the world hand in hand. Each adventure strengthened their bond, reminding them of the power of love and companionship. Back home, they settled into their life together, sharing the responsibilities of a household, navigating the challenges of daily life, and finding joy in the simplest moments. They learned to communicate openly, embracing the lessons they had learned from their pasts. One evening, while cooking dinner together, Rina paused, looking at Bobby with a thoughtful expression. "You know, we should start thinking about a family," she said softly, her heart racing at the thought. Bobby turned to her, his brow furrowed in contemplation. "Are you sure? I mean, I want that, but I want to be ready for it too." Rina nodded, her heart swelling with love for the man standing before her. "I believe we can handle anything together. We've come so far, Bobby. We've built a life based on trust and love. I think we can embrace this next chapter." He took her hand, feeling the warmth of her touch. "You're right. I never thought I'd be ready for this. But with you, I feel like we can take on the world." As the months went by, they began to discuss their hopes and dreams for the future. They painted a picture of their lives filled with laughter, love, and the pitter-patter of tiny feet. One bright morning, Rina felt a flutter in her stomach that sent her heart racing. A wave of excitement washed over her as she realized the possibility she had longed for. With shaking hands, she held a small box containing a positive pregnancy test. "Bobby," she called, her voice filled with joy. When he rushed into the room, she held up the test, her eyes shining with tears of happiness. "We're going to be parents." His eyes widened, disbelief turning into pure joy as he pulled Rina into a tight embrace. "Are you serious? This is incredible." They both laughed and cried, overwhelmed by the magnitude of the moment. The love they shared had brought them to this point, and now they were embarking on a new adventure together. As the months passed, Rina's belly grew, and Bobby found himself mesmerized by the transformation. He would often talk to the baby, reading stories aloud, and sharing his dreams for their future. Rina watched in awe as he embraced his role as a father even before their child arrived. When the day finally came, Bobby held Rina's hand, offering words of encouragement as they welcomed their beautiful baby girl into the world. Tears streamed down his face as he gazed at the tiny bundle in Rina's arms, his heart swelling with love he had never known. "Welcome to our family, little one," he whispered, brushing his fingers over the baby's soft head. As they took their daughter home, Rina and Bobby settled into their new roles, sharing sleepless nights and joyful moments. They faced challenges, of course, but their love never wavered. They learned to lean on each other, drawing strength from their bond and the life they had built together. In the years that followed, their family grew, filled with laughter, love, and precious memories. Bobby and Rina continued to support one another, reminding each other of the strength they had discovered in their relationship. As they celebrated their anniversary one evening, surrounded by the chaos of their loving family, Bobby pulled Rina aside, a smile lighting up his face. "Can you believe how far we've come?" She nodded, her heart full as she looked into his eyes. "I wouldn't trade this life for anything. You've shown me what true love feels like, Bobby." He wrapped his arms around her, holding her close. "And you've shown me that happiness is possible, that I can be whole again. Thank you for being my everything." In that moment, they knew they had created something beautiful together. Their love story was not just about the challenges they had faced, but about the joy, laughter, and unwavering support that had blossomed between them. As they stood together, surrounded by their children, Bobby and Rina realized they had built their happily ever after, a life filled with love, laughter, and the promise of many more adventures to come. They were grateful for every moment, cherishing the journey that had brought them together and the future that awaited them. And so, their love story continued, woven with the threads of hope, resilience, and an everlasting commitment to one another. Together, they faced each day with courage and love, knowing that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would always find their way back to each other, hand in hand, heart to heart. Hope you enjoyed this story. Don't forget to like it and subscribe to our channel. Your participation is essential so that we can continue to bring you more incredible stories. Share it with your friends to help our channel grow. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next video.